Welcome to Writing on Wednesdays, where I give writing advice and tips. This week, I'm joined by Sawyer.
My dog.
Today I want to talk about time. Time is actually something that I get asked about a lot, and it's something that I have a lot of frustrations with. A lot of questions I get are, how do you find the time to write? And how much time does it take you to write a novel? And when do you know is the right time to publish? So I'm going to touch on some of those things in today's episode. One of the hardest struggles can be finding time to write. Especially for me when before I was getting paid to write and I had a full-time job, it'd be really tricky to try and justify the time that I spent writing. You know, I had other obligations and other things I should be doing, I felt like, and so it's hard to say, all right, I need this time to write when I'm not necessarily getting paid for it. But I think that's just a byproduct of our society that's not so great, that focuses too much on only working on things that give you immediate direct benefit in things like cash. But there's something to be said for the time that you spent writing. I mean, even if you never publish, and even if you aren't even writing to get published, it's an enjoyable thing, and you should be doing it whether you make money or not. And so you just have to really learn to be protective of your time. If you have times that you're going to set off to write, you have to really just do that and let other things fall to the wayside. I mean, obviously, don't be ridiculous. I'm not ever going to advocate, don't take care of your baby and write instead. But you can make sure that you're setting up time where you can find time. And you have to prioritize that over other things. Sometimes the things that can get cut sound easy, like social media time, but they can still be tricky. One thing that helped me with that is if I find myself where I'm really stuck getting into social media and stuff like that, is you can have apps and things on your phone where you set timers and they can just go off and whatever time you decide is best for you to write. Let's say it's between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. You can have apps that will set it for you so that you can't use social media during that, and that makes it a lot easier to focus on writing. Also, make the people in your life aware of what you're doing, or that you have this time that you want to do something. I think that sometimes, at least for me, I would be embarrassed to say I want to write, this is important. And even now I feel weird if there's other stuff going on, if I'm well, no, I need to stay home and write. It feels silly to me, but it is my job, and you do have to protect it. Especially if you have a lot of things going on and you're busy, you do need people in your life who will support it, because it needs to be a habit, especially if you want it to be a career one day. It needs to be something that you're doing often and finding time for. With that said, I read a tweet the other day that said, we're doing young writers a disservice by telling them that they need to write every day. And that's true. I do not write every day. I write many days. I write often. But I take a break from writing for a variety of reasons. Sometimes just because I genuinely need a break, and I have scheduled breaks. I don't write on weekends, for example, because I felt like I needed that time, that I do need to have these little breaks or my brain gets mushy and I get irritable. But then there's also times where you just take it off because there's other stuff going on. I've got other plans. Hopefully once COVID restrictions are lifted, I'll be more busy and more social, and I'll have to cut back on my writing a little bit. Sometimes bad things happen and you need to take time after that from recovering. So don't be afraid to take time off, and don't beat yourself up if you plan to write one day and you're not able to do it. You need to be protective of your time. You need to put effort towards it, but don't burn yourself out or those just aren't good things. Writing is something that is important to practice on and to do even if you're not necessarily thrilled about doing it, but it's also something that I don't think should be an arduous punishment, But also, when I talk about writing often, I don't necessarily mean writing novels or writing for publication. It's okay to write things just for yourself. It's okay to just journal or spitball ideas or write a poem or write a short story, even if you've got no place for it to go. It's okay to write things just to write things. And I think that's hard to understand, but it's an important part of the process. It's how you learn to write well, and how you also learn what your voice is. That's how you find your voice in doing it. And it's also something that is just good to keep practicing the muscles. And so I think there's a difference though between writing for fun and writing for work. And so when you say write often, it doesn't have to be just for work. It can be things that are fun, that are silly, it can be whatever. Just kind of try and keep the juices flowing in between times, but also make sure that you're taking enough break. How long it takes me to write a novel, it varies. It really, really varies. I would say on average, though, just the amount of time I spent working on it, not necessarily the consecutive time, I would say it takes me between 3 to 6 months. Sometimes that 3 to 6 months is spread out over 3 to 6 months, and sometimes it's spread out over 18 months or 2 years, depending on what's going on. Sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes you have other things that call to you that you want to work on, and sometimes you're going through rough patches emotionally, and that makes it more difficult to tap into your work. So I mean, I don't beat myself about the length of time that it takes me to write novels. I don't. But really, every writer I know is different. I do think that nowadays, when you're talking about like a standard publishing house model, there is an expectation that you should be able to put out one book at least every 1 to 2 years. At least that's how I feel coming in the young adult category, which is the only genre I have published in. So I don't really know about other ones if there's a different expectation. And then obviously there's authors who will take much longer than that, but it kind of depends on your fan base and what genre you're writing. I think fantasy, because especially they tend to be such big epic books, there can be a longer gap between the two of them, but some fantasy authors are of course very productive. So it really varies. I'm making generalizations, but I would say that's generally what I've heard and what I understand. And finally, how do you know when is the right time to publish your novel? And that is a very tricky question. I mean, there's a couple different parts to that, and the number one being, how do you know when your novel is done? And that's easy to think when you get to the end that it's done, but that's really just the beginning. I would say that my novels are never, the first draft, when I get to the end, they're done, but in the loosest sense of the word. There's still so much more work that needs to be done. There's sometimes entire characters that are deleted and added after that. There's whole scenes that get changed and shifted around. It depends on what the book needs that need to be, sometimes revisions are huge, sometimes they're actually very light. So it kind of really depends on the book on how much will be changed with that. How do you know when a novel is done? And I think one way to do that is you need to get outside feedback. It's important to try and find beta readers or friends. It's good if you can find friends who know things about writing and in the industry, but it's also good, like, if you have a friend who just likes to read, it's good to even, like, get their opinion too, because it's still feedback. If you're going with the publisher, the revision's a whole separate thing that we'll cover farther down. But if you're talking about how do you know when it's done, I think when you read it multiple times, you've made changes, is the time that you start looking for either an agent or an editor if you're planning to go with self-publishing. And if it's your first time self-publishing, this will be your very first thing you've published, I really think it's important that you make sure that you get multiple beta readers, that you get multiple editors to make sure that you're catching things and going over stuff, because this is your first time. You don't know all the things that you don't know. For example, my first book that I self-published was actually like my 8th book I'd written or something like that. I don't remember now. It was a while back. And I had dozens of people read it, including a college professor that I knew and a high school teacher that I knew. I also hired editors. So I mean, there were still people who found errors, and I do have an issue with errors that I don't fully understand, but I will talk about that later too. But it was dozens of people went over it. I had a lot of people read it beforehand. I had a lot of editors read it before I self-published. It was a lot, because I wanted to know. And I'd written more books after that, and I had written so by the time I published it, I had written, I don't know, 13, 14 books, something like that, 15. I'd written 16. I remember. I had written 16 books before I published my first book, and it was the 8th book that I had written that I published, and it had been read by a lot of people. And so I think that helps me kind of figure out when it was at the end, because I got outside perspective, and I also was just writing so much, and I was understanding more about my writing, and I could go back and read my older books and see the mistakes I had made, see the errors I made, and the way I would change things. And when you can really look back at your work and see mistakes, that will help you realize that you're getting a better perspective on your current work in progress, I think. But it's always hard to have a perspective on whatever you're currently working at. I think I would definitely also recommend taking some time. I know actually when you finish your first book, it can be really exciting, but especially if you're going to self-publish, and even if you're going to find an editor, or an agent, I think it's a good idea to step back and give yourself some space, some time, a few months, put it in a drawer and kind of forget about it, which I know is hard to do, but that gives you some perspectives. You can go over and read it and see stuff. Errors will become more obvious, inconsistencies, plot holes, stuff like that, because when you read it, when you're close to it, your brain kind of fills in the parts that you missed, but when you get distance, you kind of forget, and so then you can easier find more holes, and then you make sure that it's kind of more as polished as it can be before you send it off to an agent or start looking for beta readers and editors. I think a bit more later on in the series I will focus on trying to find how to find agents, editors, and the publishing aspects going forward. But right now I'm just going to focus on writing. I still have a few more writing tips, and I still have some more questions that people ask me about before I start talking about the publishing aspect of it. Thank you for tuning in to another Words on Wednesdays with me and my special guest, Sawyer. I'll be back next week with more writing tips, and I will also be back on Monday with another review when I do musings on Monday. As usual, please leave questions or comments about things you'd like to know about writing, and I will try to answer them or incorporate them in future videos. Until then, happy writing. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss a thing.